So when I came to residency at UCSF, I did not expect to study homelessness. But I spent a lot of time on the inpatient wards at San Francisco General, and half of our patients were homeless. Taking care of them would go something like this. We admit them, maybe to the ICU, maybe to the floor. After a couple of days of patching them up, with the help of institutional police, we would discharge them to the street. Inevitably, a few days later, they would be back. I remember thinking, this is not what I came here to do. This is nuts. There's got to be a better way. So when I started my research fellowship, I took to heart the advice that the best questions to study are the things that drive you the most crazy. I knew what it was for me. This decision has led to a very satisfying career studying homelessness, what causes it, what the consequences are, and what we can do about it. Along the way, I picked up a couple of lessons that I thought I would share. So when I start my fellowship, all the other fellows were, actually very smartly, meeting with mentors, checking out data sets, trying to figure what papers they should write. I was probably not so smartly making cold calls to the Department of Public Health, asking them, so what are we going to do about homelessness? I started to attend a whole bunch of meetings. I read all these articles. I realized that homeless people are admitted to the hospital a lot because they've got a lot of comorbid conditions. They've got really poor access to care. We hit lower admission thresholds. Come into the hospital. It's really hard to get them out of there. The costs mount. I read about this cool program called Respite. It's recuperative care for homeless people who are too sick to be on the street, but not quite sick enough to be in the hospital. In a really small study, the VA had tried this at one site, and they had managed to equalize the length of stay between people who are homeless and people who aren't. I thought, this is what we need. Turns out San Francisco had a tiny program. The only problem was I had never actually met someone who had successfully gotten a patient in there. So I start making phone calls to the DPH, and I say, I have this great idea for my fellowship project. We're going to start this respite facility, and then I'm going to randomize homeless patients who are at the General to either go there or not go there and see what happens to length of stay and readmission rates. I was so incredibly excited, except somehow I missed the point that this was absurdly too ambitious for a fellows project, and also missed the point that both healthcare and homelessness are incredibly political issues in San Francisco. So in about November, after countless meetings and protocols, my project exploded in a flurry of bad politics. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I could have been on a beach in Tahiti for all I have to show. My fabulous mentor, Jenny Haas, told me not to worry. She said, why don't you spend a couple of weeks reading the newspaper? Now, I'm a New Yorker. I didn't realize it was possible to get out of bed in the morning without reading the New York Times, so I kind of was game. On the other hand, I was skeptical that this was going to do anything. But I showed up at work every day, stack of newspapers in hands, put my legs up on the desk, and read from cover to cover, until one day I come across this article buried in the A section about a huge national study that's been done of people all across the country who are homeless. I grab the article, race out of my office, and quite literally bump into Jenny Haas, who's walking into my office holding the same article. We go into her office. We pull up these newfangled search engine thingies. We type in the name of the study, press a few buttons, and lo and behold, a couple keystrokes later, we come up with this treasure trove of data. I learned to do statistics on that data set. And a week after my final project was due for my stats class, I turn in a paper which shows my results that homeless people all across the country have really poor access to ambulatory care, really high rates of ED use, really high rates of hospitalization. I send it to JAMA, they accept it, and my career is off. Which leads me to my first lesson. When things are really not going your way, keep calm and read the New York Times. I'm only kind of joking, because the thing is, the reason Jenny told me to read the newspaper was that she knew what I know then. If you actually want to do policy-related research, you need to know what the discussions are going on about policy, and you need to get in there and engage yourself with these discussions. I think this is great advice for any academic, but I actually think it's even more important for us at UCSF. We are at a public institution, and we have a special responsibility to the public to use our expertise to inform policy debates about everything going on that's meant to improve health. So that experience behind me, I continue to do work when another mentor of mine, David Bangsberg, is asked to give a talk at a housing conference at UC Berkeley. He's going out of town, so he asked me if I'll go in his stead. This was going to be my first big talk. I spend all this time preparing this talk, rehearsing it, practicing it. I buy some new clothes. I get myself over to Berkeley. I walk into this room, and it is packed. The first speakers start to speak. They're full professors of economics, men about 30 years older than me, gray hair, nice suits, great talk, and the audience is belligerent. I mean, we're talking all but throwing tomatoes. I start eyeing the emergency exits with longing looks, and the person sitting next to me turns out to be a dean at Berkeley who's supposed to introduce me. She sees my rising panic, looks at me, and says, "This is not a friendly audience." Really? But then she says, "You know what? You're a doctor. Forget your slides. Don't give your talk. People love doctors. Go up there, tell them a couple of good stories, make your main points, and get out of there. They'll love it, and they'll listen to you." I look at her like she's kind of crazy, but as I'm walking up to the podium, my knees literally shaking, I decide to scrap my talk. I introduce myself as a practicing physician at San Francisco General. I tell a couple of stories about my patients. I slide in the 3 main points of my now abandoned talk, and the audience loves it. I get all these great comments, all these great questions, and there wasn't a tomato in sight. So that brings me to my second lesson. Sometimes you need to just abandon your talk and tell a few good stories, because people listen to doctors. People still listen to doctors because they believe in us, and that is an incredible benefit. It's often also a really big responsibility, because if people are going to listen to us, we have an obligation to tell the truth. Because if we don't tell the truth, we're going to blow that trust that's been placed in us. But I think we also have an obligation to speak out. Because if people are willing to listen to us, we need to be sure to get out there and to talk about all the things that influence health. So this experience over, I go back to my desk, I write a bunch more papers, but I'm stubborn, and I haven't quite given up on the idea of respite. So I keep attending all these meetings at the Department of Public Health, and I keep writing papers that support the idea of we need to do something about all these homeless people being hospitalized so much. One day, while I was attending on the wards at the General, I'm sitting in the residence room, my phone rings, and it's one of my colleagues at the Department of Public Health who tells me that then Mayor Newsom has decided to get behind respite in a big way. And he asked me if I'll come and run the program. I said to him, "Oh no, I'm a researcher. I don't run programs. You don't want me." But he kept talking, and I agreed to do it. I spent 6 wonderful months opening respite. I spent my days thinking about things like funding streams, staffing ratios, admission protocols, and my personal favorite, paint colors. It was a great 6 months, and at the end of it, I hired a great staff, including reaching into our own department to find a really fabulous woman to run the program, and I went back to my regular job. The thing was, during those 6 months, I didn't exactly write quite as many papers as I normally would have. And the funny thing is that years of trouble trying to open that respite program have found its way into one tiny little line on my 30-page resume that actually doesn't say anything about all the work that I did or what it meant to me. And that brings me to my next lesson. The most important things that we do often don't find their way onto our CV, and they often don't count when we go up for promotion. And I think what I've learned is to do them anyway. We need to do these things because this is the work that gives our work meaning. These are the things that feed our souls. And you know what? You just have to trust that it's going to work out in the end. So as I was doing all of this work, still seeing patients in clinic and in the hospital and walking around the city, it became hard not to notice that the homeless people seemed to be getting older and older. I had the opportunity to collaborate with Judy Hahn in our department, where we went through a series of studies that had been done on homelessness across the years and looked to see what was going on. And we found that the homeless population was aging 2/3 of a year for every calendar year that went by. 11% of the homeless population had been 50 or older in the early 90s, and by the early 2000s, when we wrote this paper, 1/3 of them were. We wrote up this paper and we submitted it to 4 or 5 journals until it finally found a home as a brief report in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. The day after that paper comes up, I wake up to find a banner headline across the San Francisco Chronicle reporting the results of that paper. Our little paper had started a national conversation that's still going on today about the aging of the homeless population. This is important because right now the median age of homeless adults in our country is 50. This has huge implications for health and for policy. I was really curious about this and wanted to learn more. And so with some funding from the NIA, an amazing community advisory board, and a really fearless staff, we've recruited 350 homeless people 50 and older from the streets, from the shelters, from free food lines and recycling centers in Oakland, and we're following them. And I've learned a lot. For one, 80% of our homeless population is African American in a city that's 28% African American. 41% of our participants were never homeless until their 50s. We found high rates of chronic disease, traumatic brain injury, cognitive and mobility impairments. We do mobility testing on folks, and these folks have trouble walking across a room, which really raises questions about how they are surviving on the streets, living under underpasses, walking miles each day with all of their worldly belongings on their back because they can't afford a bus fare. Their stories are as varied as they are horrible. A lot of them have been homeless their entire adult lives, following childhoods marked by abuse and deprivation. Others have made big mistakes, but they've paid their debt to society and they're just hoping for another chance. And still others have lived quiet lives. These are the men and women who sweep our floors, who haul our boxes, who stock our shelves, who do all the hard work that makes our lives so much easier. And then they find themselves late in life living in an economy that is unforgiving for people who have little higher education, finding themselves beset by crazily rising housing costs, and realize that it's just one thing, the death of a family member, the loss of a job, that sends them on a downward spiral that leaves them on the street alone and bewildered. They're not all angels, but let's face it, who is? I do know that they deserve a whole lot better than what they've gotten. I'm getting pretty impatient with the fact that we can make such incredible discoveries that improve health so much for few people, and yet we can't seem to get our acts together to create an environment, to create a chance for health for so many. I've been following with a lot of interest this conversation in the blogosphere about whether hospital readmission penalties should be adjusted for SES of the patients. For the record, I agree. It's crazy to think that hospitals like the General should be penalized because we take care of the poorest and the most vulnerable. But I think it's really important that we don't stop at adjusting, because adjusting for SES is never actually going to change anything. If we're serious about improving health worldwide, we need to start talking about all those conditions that make it so difficult for people to be healthy. I'm sure you're all familiar with this slide that talks about how little of health is determined by what we do in the medical visit. I'm not saying we should stop making these exciting discoveries. I know it intellectually, and to be honest, I know it personally, because my own life has been so dramatically altered by just those discoveries. But I think it's really important that we reflect on that other half of the pie, all those other things that we need to do to create a healthy environment. I think it's worth stopping and thinking about everything that we can do, and thinking about what it says about us as a society that 80% of the participants in my study are African American, and recognizing that it doesn't say anything that any of us should be proud about. I think we should reflect what it means that we live in a region that is so filled with wealth and excitement and innovation, but we've somehow been able to take it and accept it that we have hordes of older adults spending their last years alone and afraid on our streets. I think it's time that we started to talk about all those things that influence health that aren't in their medical care. And because we've been given so much, we at UCSF are so lucky to be surrounded by such great colleagues doing such great work and all working so hard, doing really amazing things and following our own passions. I think we need to ask ourselves, with all that we've been given, including this amazing bully pulpit from which to speak, are we really doing everything that we can? Thank you.